picture you just saw was from Highlights magazine. If you remember when you were a kid, or you maybe have kids now, it was that magazine. I think it was, it was a scholastic magazine meant to help kids learn how to read. But the best part, most people always thought, was the picture search, the hidden picture search. So that's what you just saw a glimpse of. And a little bit of context. So, I look. One of the things I often try and do is look for moments where I get kind of like emotionally charged or passionate, or maybe start thinking irrationally about a topic, however small it might be or insignificant it might be, because it's an interesting test case. It's a use case to see when my mind breaks that way, when it feels justified, or it has a blind spot or a bias, or something's core to my identity, and I start acting in a non-rational way or an irrational way. I like to pick on that. And it's not because the outcome or the topic matters that much. Again, it's just an opportunity to really explore and learn directly from me and how my mind works. So this was an example of that I thought would kind of be an interesting, fun one to share. So the specific context of the event, so me and my son were doing one of these hidden picture searches, as we often do. And there's two types of picture searches they have. There's a black and white version, and there's a colored version. I always prefer the colored version. And, part of this is I'm kind of teaching my son about the picture search as we go through it in a fun way. But the colored one I always prefer because it gives you an edge, right? When you add color into the mix, it makes it easier to find in the picture. Because if, the paintbrush is purple, when you're looking in the picture, you can scan and see where's the purple stuff, and it's got to be there somewhere, right? Versus black and white, it's really just the shape you have to try and find, because everything's the same color. So it just makes it that much harder to find it. So as we're doing these picture searches, I kind of give him tips like that, different little tricks and rules to kind of go by to help you, guide you through this picture search. So that's one of the big ones. So we were on this picture search, we were kind of going through it, and there was a fish, as you saw in the picture. Now, from my eyes, as I was looking at that fish in the key, right, in the legend to let you know what you need to find, it was a purple fish. So purple's always a good one because there's typically not a ton of purple in a picture, depending on what it is. And in this one, it was that. It was like that, not a lot of purple. So I did what I did, and I mentioned to my son, like, all right, we got a purple fish. We'll scan, we'll look in the purple areas, and we'll find this fish. And between the two of us, we're usually pretty good at it. So we did our business, and we're scanning, no fish. So there's a couple purple things in the picture. I don't think you could see it in the one I shared, but there was, some clothing that people were wearing that was purple. So we kept coming back to that and looking, and no fish. So we were convinced something was wrong. There must have been a mistake. So we were about to look up, the answer key to it, in the book, wherever it was. And as I was about to go look, he found what he thought was the fish. So he points to it and he says, I think that's it. So as you'll see in the picture, and again, from my eyes, from what I saw, it was the fish. It looked like the shape of the fish, but it was a different color. It was like more of like a tannish color than the purple that was in the legend. So we laughed and joked, and I said, I think you did find it, good job. But I was like, actually, I'm not sure that color is the same. So we went back and forth trying to figure it out. Ends up, it was the fish. But what's interesting about the story is the reaction I had to it. Now, again, I was in kind of a safe space. I knew it wasn't that serious of a topic, but put that aside. I had a reaction to it. I was bothered by the fact that they created this and they broke kind of a unspoken contract we have where, like, hey, you the shape's got to match the shape, and the color's going to match the color, and then I'll go find that picture in the other picture. I'll find that item. And they seem to have broken that, right? And more than them just kind of breaking that unwritten rule, if you will, which maybe on a principle level you're bothered by, it directly went against kind of a rule or a framework I had ingrained in my head. There's a process I go through when I do this puzzle search, as silly as it might be. And one of my checks that I go through is, okay, look at that color and you find that color here. And that's the guide, that's the framework you use. And it was rooted in logic, and it makes sense, and it's in line with the rules of the game, if you will. So everything on it, in theory, checked out. And I've been doing it for a long time, to the point where I even taught my son about it. So I've made this now public that, hey, this is something that I want you to know about. That's a good thing in how you do it. So again, you kind of see the parallels here of where I'm going. You start thinking about how we formulate views and opinions or, strong conclusions on certain topics, and you check a lot of those boxes, right? It's something you've done for a long time. You kind of checked the peripheral logic of it, and it all makes sense. It's right. It holds. You tell other people about it. You let it be clear that this is something you believe strongly in and that it works this way. And all these things just continue to build and build the foundation of like a belief that becomes tied to your identity that you now are responsible for and must defend. And again, in this silly circumstance, that's what happened, to the point that I was angry. I was saying to my son and my wife, like, they can't do this. They can't just change the color, right? That, because where my head went is, this changes how do I know how to trust any rules anymore? Nothing means anything anymore, right? If they're going to start doing that, how do I not know they're not going to change the shape on another one? And that's what they're going to want me to find. And I should say, I tend to do that. I tend to catastrophize things and think, I go from a first level of the pictures didn't match exactly to a 50th level of like the whole magazine's going under and the whole thing's a scam. And, you could jump to that really quickly. That's kind of the way I've thought historically. So I try and address that. But in this case, that's kind of how I felt. Like you've undercut a core foundation of this thing, and it's the implications are immense if you do that. And I texted it to other people, and I was looking for people to validate my views and tell me, like, hey, these purples don't match, because my son was convinced they were a close enough match, which is a whole interesting thing on its own, that he found the fish. So he was kind of incentivized to say, yeah, no, this is legit. But in my mind, it was this must be a mistake, right? I wasn't willing to give up this concept of this framework that I'd established. I wasn't willing to give in on that. There must be some other explanation, and I needed people to tell me there was another explanation. And I reached out to people continuously until I found somebody that agreed, because I needed that. And you just obviously step back and look at it and say, well, what are you really angry about? Like, what's the point? And I think the interesting learning for me is, as I reflect on it now, I can still, obviously it was me, be in the mindset where I still believe I'm right. Like, there's a degree of rightness in this. Now, who's to say what right really is or objective truth really is? But I think the logic holds. And for me, that's often a test. Now, logic can hold to many different things. So it's not necessarily sufficient. It's sufficient, but it's not sufficient, but it's necessary that the logic holds. So in this case, you have that going, where you're like, hey, I can think about this. I can step back and I can look at it from different perspectives, and this still makes sense. Like, the colors should match. That's the premise of the game. So in that vein, there was that part of me that just felt like, hey, I'm right here. Call it what you want, the moral high ground or this deep degree of certainty, but I felt right in it. So that was certainly part of it, and probably a big part of it. The other piece, as I mentioned, though, was just that the implication of it being wrong. Right? If that framework doesn't hold, something I've thought of and used for such a long time goes away. And again, does that mean other frameworks go away? Like, you can see how you can look at a situation like this or in a more important one and say, I could see how maybe that's tied to your identity, but who cares? Why does that matter so much to your identity? But you start to see, in this simple example, for me at least, that they're intermingled. They're chained together, dominoes, whatever you want to call it. But it's not just about this one principle that goes away. It's the implication. If you start thinking second, third, fourth, fifth level, does that mean other principles don't apply? And all of a sudden, this fear and this uncertainty of what does anything mean anymore? And obviously, again, you could step back in this situation and see it's somewhat absurd and it's ridiculous, and maybe the colors did actually match, or they just got messed up in the printing. It's not that big of a deal. But at least for me, it shows me, like, hey, it doesn't matter the topic. If certain criteria are met, your mind will go where it wants to go. It will dismiss rational thought. It will dig in, right? It will be that lawyer I've talked about in other videos. It's an amazing lawyer to build the case for why those fish did not match. And that's a huge problem. And it just takes super active effort to identify that and turn it off. And what I've started to identify, again, I like identifying these moments for me because I learn from them, but it's also about building habits, right? The little stuff matters. If you let it go in this little scenario, the odds are it's going to happen in the big scenario. So you have to see it wherever it is and kind of spot it. And you don't have to ruin your life over it, right? And be stressed all the time that something like this is happening, but just be aware, just be cognizant of it. I think it makes a huge, huge difference.